You might be wondering, what kind of crazy keyboard is this? Am I on the right channel? It is called keyboard after all. Well, I got something different for you this time. I want to introduce you to my new small form factor workstation setup. That's right, I built an Intel 12th generation Alder Lake i9 based workstation with an RTX 3080 and crammed it all into a 10-liter case, so either I'm a very brave man or an idiot, or both. Well, let's find out how it turned out. So, for those that do not really want to watch me build this whole entire thing, let me get straight to the point. I shoved the hottest, most power-hungry CPU with one of the largest and most thirsty GPUs into a tiny little box, and it didn't burn down my house yet. And I can tell you the build turned out amazing, so let's get started. Let me tell you, trying to get computer parts these days is probably as hard as winning a key cult. It was a painful process, and especially for in-demand items like the i9 CPU and the RTX 3080, it was either pay up or too bad. I managed to get my hands on what I needed, but I did pay. Oh, did I pay for it. So the first up, yes, this is an Alder Lake build. So the start of the show is a 12th generation Alder Lake i9 12900K CPU. Pretty interesting big small design with both power and efficiency cores. This CPU is pretty much the top dog out there, second only to the Threadripper. For the motherboard, I went with the Aorus Z690i Ultra with DDR4. I know, why go Alder Lake and not use DDR5? Finding an ITX DDR5 board with DDR5 sticks were pretty much impossible. Plus, I didn't see too much of a performance increase with DDR5, so I'll save that one for next time. However, if you do end up going for this motherboard, make sure you update the BIOS. It doesn't really work otherwise. I went with the 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro 3600MHz, and for storage, I'm using a combination of 1TB Samsung 980 Pro for the OS and 1TB of standard 980 for data and storage. Given that I'm building into an ITX case, I needed a SFX sized power supply with at least 750 watts for the components. For this duty, I decided to go with the Lian SP750, not just for its specifications, but because it also comes with very flexible braided cables. Next up is this thing, the one thing that was the most extremely difficult to get. I didn't realize that GPUs were this low in supply, but anyways, I managed to snag one through Newegg, and it was a painful process. Given Alder Lake's notoriety around heat, I needed to maximize the cooling that would fit into this tiny case. For that, I went with the Corsair H100i Elite Cappelix, since it was confirmed that this cooler is compatible and works with LGA 1700. The box doesn't say it is, but it actually does, and it works fine. So, what did I decide to shove all of these primo components into? This thing, this 10-liter beast dubbed ZX1 by Iqunix. And I have to say, this little case really made the overall build of such a small form factor manageable and rather enjoyable in a weird masochistic type of way. First of all, it's a full aluminum construction. This makes the case extremely rigid while remaining very light. The aluminum does a great job of dissipating heat, so it's also a perfect material for this application. The anodization of this case was perfect. Plus, it just looks so good against something like my KBD-8X Mark II, which is also anodized black. It was like love at first sight. Finally, the entire thing is a screwless design and it's pretty much fully modular. I'll show you what I mean by that later. But this modularity allows for this tiny little 10-liter case to do some amazing things, like fit stuff. Stuff that is probably too big for it in reality. But this was a little case that could. Alright, so let's start the build process. I started by removing the SSD heatsink and the PCB so that I could install the two Samsung NVMe drives. I placed the 980 Pro in Bay 0 and 980 in Bay 1. Then reinstall the whole entire assembly back onto the motherboard as you see here. Then flip the motherboard over and install the backplate for the Corsair H100i cooler. Remember to do this now because otherwise you'll have to end up removing everything again to gain access to the back of the motherboard again. Next, remove and install the 12900K into the 1700 socket. You'll notice the oddly elongated design of the new 12th generation below as you see here. Finally, install the two sticks of Corsair RAM into the memory slots as you see. Now your major components are installed onto the motherboard. Remember that for this build, the CPU cooler comes way at the end, so you won't worry about that right now. Here is a quick look at how small the SFX power supplies are next to my Samsung Z Flip 3 phone. Okay, now let's get the case prepped. Remember what I said about the Iqunix case being super modular? Take a look. Essentially, every panel is held together by strong magnets and they come off with ease. Then you can also start removing a few of the screws and start taking off all the interior panels and auxiliary boards as well. This will help to create a nice open interior space for you to start mounting the critical components like your power supply or your motherboard. Really great design work from Iqunix here. The fact that you could remove all the panels, you can easily plug in connectors and cables without trying to fish them through little cracks in the case. It also opens up the case for your vertical riser cable, which comes included with the Iqunix ZX1 case as well, so it makes the overall process much easier than it actually would be. Now I can install my gigantic Asus TUF Gaming RTX 3080 GPU. This GPU is about 300mm long and 2.7 slots wide, but as you can see here, it fits into the case with some room to spare. With the GPU installed, now we can drop in the radiator. I ended up using a few of the supplied washers that came with the Corsair kit to create additional space between the fans and the top of the radiator plate. This also helps to create some space between the GPU power cables so that the fans don't touch it. I wanted to give this cooler the best fighting chance, so I upgraded the thermal compound to the Thermal Grizzly Kryonaut. This stuff is so thick that I couldn't even do an X or a few dots, rather I had to spread it as evenly as possible on the CPU die. Now you can install the water block and the pump like you see right here. One thing to note is that if you do use the H100i Elite Cappelix, it requires this commander unit for it to really function. So this means it's additional space for your case required, so please keep that in mind. Here is the final look at how all these components fit into this case. Honestly, I went into this thinking that the cable management would be non-existent and this was going to be one terribly messy build. However, I was so pleasantly surprised that there were enough small crevices and space available to make it neat and tidy inside. The radiator also has a good amount of clearance from the top and everything manages to fit just right. Just overall so clean. So now let's fire up this bad boy and run some tests. So, given that I'll be using this workstation for a variety of tasks, I decided to throw multiple workloads at it. First one up was Premiere Pro video rendering, since this is probably going to be one of the major tasks I'll be using this for. Overall, the build handled this admirably, handling an 11-minute 4K video render in about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Being an Intel CPU with integrated graphics and quick sync enabled, it's able to utilize the CPU, the Nvidia GPU, as well as the iGPU to maximize all the resources it has. Even pushing the system, the thermal stayed fairly decent and the system remained rock solid. Next up, I'll be using this for games like Genshin Impact or Overwatch and so on, so I ran a quick test here as well. The games didn't stress the components that much, with the GPU probably being taxed the most. I'll show the results of all these tests in a chart shortly following this. Finally, the torture test. I ran Cinebench R23 on multi-core for about 15 minutes straight. This is where I saw the temperatures hit the highest for the CPU, with the 240mm radiator doing everything it can to keep the temperatures under control. This was the only situation I felt a little bit uncomfortable with the thermal management of the system. But let's dive into the actual temperature charts to see in detail. So as you can see here, the system stays for the most part in a comfortable or rather manageable thermal capacity. Regardless of the test, the NVMe drives as well as the memory pretty much stayed at the constant 40°C temperature, so no real changes here. Surprisingly, the GPU also remains very cool under low load, not even breaking 30°C mark when not being really pushed. Only when you push the GPU during gaming or for Premiere rendering, you see the temperatures jump to the mid-40s, which I feel is a very reasonable temperature for a GPU like this, especially in such a small little case like the Iqunix ZX1. Where the big changes are is with the CPU. As you can see, idling, the CPU remains at a reasonably cool 33°C. Under normal load like gaming or even Premiere rendering, the CPU does climb up to about 70°C, which is hot but not alarmingly hot. Remember that the Alder Lake 12900K has a TJ max of 100°C, so 70°C is still very comfortable for the CPU with a 30° headroom. However, where it gets a little bit dicey is when you start running something like Cinebench and push all the cores to the maximum for an extended period of time. During this torture test, I saw some of the performance cores hit up to about 98°C at its peak. Although this isn't hitting the TJ max causing a throttle, it is still very close to that limit, which is something that I need to keep an eye out on. However, I don't really expect to run something like this on this machine constantly, so overall I should be okay. Perhaps I'll try throwing in a few tiny nocturnal fans here and there to try to get the case to have a little bit more airflow inside. So now that I have done all this, what is my thought about the Alder Lake platform and this particular small form factor build in general? I think it's fantastic. And if you have something similar in mind, I say go for it. Yes, the 12900K runs hot, it sucks up a lot of power. However, under normal situations, it's not that crazy 100 degrees Celsius, 250 watt machine all the time. Even in a small little 10-liter case like this, I haven't really seen this beefy i9 throttle even once, and I was able to demolish pretty much everything I threw at it. It handles games no problem, and all the productivity workloads with ease. Now for the small form factor build. I remember building a micro ATX case way back that was even more frustrating than building a mini ITX into this Iqunix ZX1. I know there's a lot of horror stories about the pain of building small, but honestly, go for a well-designed case and it's not as intimidating as it can seem. Alright, I know this content was a little bit different than my usual, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like and subscribe and I'll work on more content for you in the future. Also, please leave a comment below if you like this kind of non-keyboard related video, and if you do, I could do more of this in the future as well. So, happy holidays to you, and I will see you next time. Thank you.